You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. From a numerology perspective, we're entering or about to enter a 10 year, which correlates to the Wheel of Fortune. And we get to this number 10 simply by adding the numbers of the year. So 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 6 equals 10. We can then reduce that further to get a companion card. And that 10 we reduce by adding 1 plus 0, which equals 1. And that gives us the Magician. So let's talk about the Wheel of Fortune and the Magician and what it might mean for us therapeutically this coming year. Side note, if you end up enjoying this episode, you can actually grab a digital or physical copy of my 2026 Tarot Journal, A Year with the Wheel of Fortune, on my website, thetarotdiagnosis.com. It's a very non-overwhelming journal that breaks down all the symbols in the Wheel of Fortune each month and then offers daily prompts to reflect to or pull cards to. There's also some fun simmer pot suggestions, rituals, and tarot spreads. Well, let's get back into talking about the year of the Wheel of Fortune and the Magician. So the archetype of the Wheel of Fortune represents the inevitable turning of time, of fate, the ebbs and flows of just life, luck, and change. And so we're coming out of a hermit year in 2025. And the hermit really asked us to pause and maybe go inward. And the Wheel of Fortune actually kind of now propels us forward into motion. So basically all the work that we did, this past year in 2025 was really in preparation for everything that's about to unfold in this year. And the energy of the wheel reminds us that we are both kind of like at the mercy of forces beyond our control and simultaneously really powerful participants in how we meet and respond to what happens. And to work with this card of the Wheel of Fortune is to enter into a relationship with change, which I know is very difficult for so many of us. And it really asks us to loosen our grip on certainty while still kind of like anchoring into, our own presence and our own experience. And this presence is, all we truly have at any given moment, this moment right here, right now. And it can be so easy to get lost in kind of the backwards and forward motion of the wheel and forget to steady ourselves from one moment to the next. And the Wheel of Fortune really is this kind of like ultimate lesson in coping with uncertainty and ambiguity, unpredictability. This archetype really invites us to consider, what is our relationship to control? What's our relationship to the concept of surrendering? What's our relationship to ambiguity? The Wheel of Fortune isn't always about being kind of thrown into chaotic, unknown territory. It's also about just learning to trust the rhythms of life and to attune to all the patterns that play a part of both our personal experiences and what's happening around us collectively. In many ways, the Wheel of Fortune offers kind of like a crash course in adaptability, also in grit and in a sense of personal and collective resilience. It really encourages us to view change as this kind of like integral and sacred part of being human. Change is necessary for growth, even when it feels painful and disruptive. In a Wheel of Fortune year, we may kind of find ourselves on the move a little bit more. And this could be like literally, or it could be emotionally, or maybe even collectively. And I think this movement could really bring us to surprising destinations, while at the same time allowing us to reunite with maybe parts of ourselves that we've forgotten about. So where the hermit kind of like encouraged retreat and reflection, the Wheel of Fortune is really encouraging engagement and responsiveness. And you have to remember, by embracing the year of the wheel, we're really committed to implementing all of that self-knowledge that we gained during our journey with the hermit. It's about showing up fully, even when we don't even know what's next. It's also about letting go of old stories and narratives that no longer serve us and, being curious about what could come in the future. I think it's important to remember that The Wheel of Fortune does not promise any sort of like easy outcomes. I think there's a promise of evolution where, the cycles of the wheel are not linear and, it can often feel like we're being thrown backwards just as often as we're being, propelled forward. But I think it's really important to remember, even when we are like feeling like we're going backwards or, maybe down the wheel instead of up, we still have all of the knowledge and experience and insight that we gained during previous cycles where, we were going around. And I think, this experience brings with it moments of relief, joy, pleasure, exhilaration, and then moments where we just feel like, like free falling and moments of, like hermit years where there's this kind of like deep recalibration of the self. But in all of these moments, we are invited to practice the art of perspective, which is so much like the Buddhist concept of impermanence. The wheel is very much kind of like in alignment with all of that, where, it's teaching us that nothing lasts forever, not our joy, not our struggle. Everything is always in motion. And so I think the real work when it comes to the Wheel of Fortune is trying to figure out what it might look like to be able to find our way to the center of the spinning wheel. And so when we think of the center of the wheel, we can kind of like envision the wheel and that whole experience as kind of like a spiral. So, it's still, kind of like in motion. But the center doesn't necessarily seem like it is because everything else is swirling around it. So just like the center of a spiral, the center of the wheel doesn't kind of like rise or fall with each turn. Instead, it's like pretty steady and predictable and relatively unaffected. And I think the center point becomes kind of like an ultimate form of observation, which is like a huge goal in therapy. We might not be able to live at the center all the time. We are imperfect humans. However, we can find ways to spend more time there. And in those moments, crawling away from like the chaotic outer edges of the wheel, we can find a sense of safety at the center where we can observe, rest, reassess, steady ourselves, and then plan for how we're going to manage, this next kind of journey on the wheel. And I think an important question to ask ourselves as we are entering into a Wheel of Fortune year and as we're experiencing the energy of the wheel is, are we going to allow ourselves to experience this year by clinging onto the edge? And like, I envision us all just kind of like holding on and our legs are like being flung about. Or are we going to give ourselves permission and put in the effort to learn how to return to the center, where there is this sense of, I've been having this conversation of stillness. I was going to say stillness. And I even want to be careful with that because I don't mean stillness in a literal sense here. I mean stillness as in our nervous system can see that all this stuff is happening around us and the wheel is continuously spinning, and yet we are able to regulate. So I want to take a few moments before I keep kind of moving forward with the energy of the Wheel of Fortune to give some attention to 2026's companion card, and that's the Magician. So remember earlier I was saying 2026 is a 10-year because from a numerology perspective, it reduces to 10, but we can reduce 10 further to 1 by adding 1 plus 0, and 1 is the card of the Magician. So the archetype of the Magician is all about agency. It's about recognizing that we already possess everything that we need in order to facilitate some sort of change. And another way to understand the Magician is as kind of like this psychological or really like therapeutic alchemist, someone who transforms lived experience, raw emotion, thoughts, and effort into something meaningful and usable moving forward. I also think this card reminds us that creativity doesn't always arrive fully formed, like as much as so many of us want it to. It emerges through engagement and experience, which, when paired with the Wheel of Fortune, makes engagement and experience inevitable. So if you think about it, by resisting the energy of the Wheel of Fortune, we're really resisting our inner magician and that magician energy, and then therefore stifling our own creativity. It's also important to remember that the magician doesn't wait for perfect conditions or even permission to do something or to create something or to alchemize something. They work with what's in front of them and what they have. And I think this is really important, especially on the heels of my episode on time. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, go check it out, because so many of us feel like we either have already run out of time, or there's not enough time, or we have to wait for the perfect time to do something. And, I think as a companion to the Wheel of Fortune this year, the magician is an invitation to move out of that level of passivity and into activity. And combined with the wheel, growth and healing, in this case, is less about doing it the right way at the right time and really just doing it regardless, doing it with whatever's in front of you, whatever you're experiencing. Okay, so now that I've given some attention to the magician, I want to turn back to the Wheel of Fortune. And I want to explore some of the symbols in the Wheel of Fortune that I feel are really relevant to the therapeutic energy this year. And I'm not going to be exploring all of them, because then this episode would be just wildly long. But you can grab the journal that I mentioned earlier, A Year with the Wheel of Fortune, if you are interested in exploring these symbols deeper. So the symbols that we see on the Wheel of Fortune, especially in the traditional Rider-Waite Smith imagery, are symbols like the Sphinx, the snake, the various creatures representing the four elements, clouds, all kinds of like fun stuff. I feel like this is such a symbol heavy card, and probably the most symbol heavy card. I'm racking my brain trying to think of some other images, but yeah, there's just so much happening here. And, I think because there's so much happening here, it's a good reminder that order and wisdom is still, and like that alchemical energy of the magician is always present, even when things feel chaotic and uncontrollable. And I think, when we align ourselves with these, different currents, we begin to understand what it feels like to, again, find that center of the wheel, find that center of the spiral, to be present in any given moment, even if it's just for a split second. And it's interesting. So from a psychological perspective, we could even look at the Wheel of Fortune as kind of mirroring certain concepts like post-traumatic growth, cognitive reframing, especially like narrative therapy. I feel like this is a narrative therapy card, because it really challenges us to ask questions like, okay, how do I make meaning of this phase, this stage, this experience, this situation? What story am I telling myself about where I am right now? And, what would happen if I took control, for example, of this pen as I write, this next chapter of my story? It's a card that really empowers us to kind of like reclaim authorship over our lives, even in the midst of ambiguity and change. And I think, the Wheel of Fortune is also a reminder that life is not linear, even though it kind of feels that way, especially when we, think about, again, the discussion on time or age, because, age is something that doesn't ever decrease. It continues to move forward and up. But we live in a cyclical sphere, as the earth spins, so does the Wheel of Fortune, and so does life. And there are seasons of expansion, there are seasons of contraction, there are seasons of winning and losing and knowing and not knowing. And I think this year invites us to kind of like surrender into all of that, while still making sure that we're participating with intention and curiosity and that magician energy. I think it really invites us to trust also timing, going back to that timing episode, and, kind of riding the highs, like really enjoying those and being present in those moments, and then still like meeting our lows with compassion and courage and empathy. At its core, the Wheel of Fortune really symbolizes change and these cycles that are really what I'm talking about, cycles of life and evolution and both personal and collective growth. The Wheel of Fortune, I'm kind of talking about this both like from a personal standpoint and a collective standpoint, because for me, when I think of the Wheel of Fortune, it feels like such a collective energy card. And, it reminds us that we are in a constant state of motion, and, our perspectives might be changing. And so we have to be careful with rigidity, and we have to, be curious about what we're participating in and what we're neglecting. And yeah, like trusting the process too. That's also a very like big, like therapeutic experience, like learning to trust the process. So, things might not look the way we want them to right now, but that doesn't mean that they won't look the way we want them to later on. One of my favorite symbols, getting back into the symbols of the card, is the clouds of the Wheel of Fortune. And I did a whole episode on clouds that was honestly inspired by me focusing on them while I was writing A Year with the Wheel of Fortune tarot journal. And I just found it so fascinating because in the Wheel of Fortune, you've got these very prominent clouds that you don't see as prominent in, I don't know, other cards that maybe don't represent the energy of this card. I think that there's something really special about the way that the clouds are placed in this card, especially because they're cradling the winged bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel, kind of forming this backdrop that if you're not really paying attention to, could easily just kind of blend in because, our eye wants to focus on the center of this wheel. And I think there's so much heavy symbolism here with the clouds representing, possibly that space between like earth and the unknown, like a threshold type of energy. And this, again, concept of how change happens regardless of our desire to control it. And, it's really cool symbolically and literally, clouds contain all four elements, air and water on the surface, earth in all of their particles, and then fire and their potential for lightning to exist within them. And they're never static. They dissolve, they reshape, they drift. And this kind of like mutability contrasts sharply with some of the fixed zodiac signs that they're surrounding, which I think really highlights this like core truth of the wheel that nothing, no matter how stable it seems, is immune to change. And something that's like really exciting too is if we get into the myth of it all, and this isn't really my forte, I know it's important and, I talk about it whenever I think it's relevant, but, the work that I do here is very practical in terms of tarot and psychology and mental health. But when we look at things through a myth-esque lens and we look at clouds, for example, they really are symbols of a threshold, places where something could be revealed or hidden, or when something might be offered or emerging. I mean, think about all the aces, for example, like something's being offered and emerging through a cloud. And then psychologically, they mirror kind of moments of when times are maybe obscured, so transitions, uncertainty, just like feeling like incomplete, something's not quite there. And something that I think is important too is just because we can't see something because of these clouds are like literally clouding something, it doesn't mean that it's flawed or we're not supposed to see it. That's just the nature of change. It goes back to like that magician energy too, that we're not going to have everything and have the perfect time. We're supposed to use and take advantage of whatever's in front of us, what we can see and what we do have access to. Another symbol I want to talk about is the snake. And I think what's cool about the snake is that we're actually leaving the year of the snake and entering into the year of the horse. But when we're thinking about the snake specifically, it really represents the ability to shed one's skin and maybe to metaphorically die in one form and be reborn in another. And the snake doesn't resist that process. It doesn't resist the process of change, knowing each cycle they're going to experience the shedding. And even though it's super vulnerable, while that kind of like old layer sloughs off, it still kind of leans into that discomfort of shedding because renewal cannot come without it. And so when we think of the Wheel of Fortune and this like up and down and this, being able to be at the top of the wheel sometimes and be at the bottom of the other, we can sometimes think of that descent, especially in relation to where the snake is, as preparation for that new skin. Like, okay, I'm about to shed this. I'm maybe not really wanting this, but having this perspective of, I can't wait to see what comes next. So now I want to take some time to speak more about this idea of the center of the Wheel of Fortune. And I know it probably seems like I'm spending so much time talking about that. And I mean, let's be honest, like tarot is a tool of projection. So clearly I'm projecting some of my own stuff when I talk about this. And so, perhaps you're getting a bit of an insight into things that I'm working on in my own personal life. And maybe that is trying to find the center. So obviously I've been like really fascinated by this and thinking about it. And I think that is really what the Wheel of Fortune is teaching us, or maybe me. Nothing lasts forever. Not our moments of suffering, not these moments of euphoria, like I mentioned, not all our joy, not our sadness. Everything kind of has a limit. And our life, the world, and the lives of people around us are constantly in motion. And from both a somatic and emotional perspective, the goal is always to figure out how can we, be responsive versus reactive? How can we kind of crawl our way to the metaphorical middle of this wheel so that we feel a little bit more balanced, so that we can get kind of this maybe vision of what's really going on around us so that we know how to respond. And it's funny. So I grew up in Florida. And so I grew up with hurricanes and constantly, hearing about the center of the storm, the eye of the hurricane. And I think about that when I think about the center of the wheel, it being kind of the eye of the hurricane. It is eerily still and quiet despite absolute destruction and chaos swirling around it. And yet you kind of just past the storm's edges, calm awaits. And so this, center point becomes this ultimate space of mindful observation and integration. It's that kind of point where, awareness, where we can maybe see a little bit more clearly without, being flung around, and, in the actual outer layers of the storm, or in this case, the wheel. And from a therapeutic perspective, I really do feel like the center represents regulation, this calm, safe experience of being at ease despite, what's happening around you. And I think it's important to note that calm ease that I'm talking about does not mean that we are without pain. It does not mean that we are without discomfort. It doesn't mean that change isn't existing. It doesn't mean that we're not still experiencing chaos or uncertainty. It just means that we've learned how to regulate and exist alongside of it instead of being swept away by it. And I really think this looks like finding small moments to be present, engaging in different rituals, feeling how our body is in any given moment, tending to our breath, moving our bodies in ways that release tension and stress. It's having new experiences. It's embracing that magician energy of figuring out what to do with what we have, based on any given moment of wherever our placement is on the wheel. So like I mentioned earlier, if this is interesting to you, this concept of diving deeper into the Wheel of Fortune, you can absolutely spend an entire year with this card. You can head over to thetarotdiagnosis.com and grab that 2026 tarot journal. I just want to thank you all so much. I still have another episode I'm going to do before the end of the year, but I want to say thank you for being with me on this journey again and finding value in this work of tarot and psychology and mental health. It's just wild how many people I've been able to connect with. And I love talking to all of you and hearing your perspectives and hearing about how the tarot diagnosis kind of fits into your tarot practice and world. It's really exciting. So thank you so much for being here on the Tarot Diagnosis Wheel of Fortune. But I am wishing everyone a very prosperous and healing year of the wheel. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.